resume, and then over to you.
Cool, thank you, Thomas. And yeah, you can see that it's on the screen. Yeah, everything's okay. Lovely. Well, good evening all. I am Dewi Jones here from Innovis, and hope you're all at home, relaxed, hopefully having some tea or something, and you can watch this at leisure, or a recording. Are you recording this, Thomas, by the way? Yeah, fine, so people can have this again. So I'm not going to dwell for too much tonight, because I like to show pictures and talk to them, because I'm a simple soul. So we'll do a lot of that, and we'll just run through some of the key elements I think that are important for us involved in the sheep industry. So I'm going to start just by giving a little bit of background about our business. Some of you may have come across Innovis or our other business, our artificial breeding business called AB Europe. In fact, we have quite a lot of your graduates coming through to do industrial placements at AB Europe, and we've got lots of your qualified graduates working for Innovis. So we're big supporters of Harper. So you've got a business here that's very aligned to you as a university. And we think you've got some of the best students currently in the UK coming out. So that's just a good little bit of independent comment for you. So I set up the business in 2002. I had worked in the university in Aberystwyth for 10 years, and before that studied in Aberystwyth and was brought up on the family farm in North Wales. So I'm from a farm in North Wales, studied in Aberystwyth, and went over and worked and studied in New Zealand for just over 2 years, and for some bizarre reason ended up back in Aberystwyth working. And the timing sort of fell in place that Aberystwyth are just about to look at sheep research work, and that was sort of my field, and that's what we did. So 10 years in academia, but very applied research, taking lots of different science, both to market and also some fundamental stuff that was then going to market. But after doing that for that time, by 2002, we'd created a commercial business, and it's quite difficult trying to get the sort of the pressures of a commercial business working within an academic institution. Quite often the two sort of clash at times. So in 2002, I left the university and we set up this business. And one of the key elements I think that's important, because I'm conscious there may be somebody on this call that may be thinking of doing this or is involved in something like this. And that's the fact that when you go to do something like this, you just go and do it, and don't leave yourself a safety blanket, because only too often you see spin-out companies set up, but they've actually got jobs or still lecturing or still involved in academia or their previous job. And that quite often splits the hunger, the desire to have to make something work. So I left my university days, I went into the commercial sector, and our first business really, which we involved within the university, was artificial breeding in sheep specifically. And that involved semen collection, artificial insemination, embryo transfer, and sort of export of germplasm. And if any of you have been involved in sheep, you will realize that they're more difficult than cows. We can't actually get through the cervix in a sheep. We actually have to use laparoscopy. And by the nature of it, by going into the body cavity with the semen, we put it directly into the fallopian tubes, and that means it's a veterinary procedure, which obviously limits it then to pedigree breeders more often than not, because it means that it's quite costly for a commercial farming operation. Now, after doing this for a few years as a business, and we set up a business, a centre in Malvern, a centre in Edinburgh in Northern Ireland, so quite a substantial artificial breeding business in sheep. I was in Edinburgh one day, and it was Burns night, I remember, and there was a ewe waiting to be flushed, and I was looking at this ewe thinking, why aren't you on the 25th of January in lamb? Because you should be. And I then delved a bit more into it and realized that she'd actually hadn't had a lamb for 3 years. She'd actually only had one lamb herself. She then had mastitis, other problems, and hadn't been able to lamb. But she was a ewe that was breeding some very, very showy animals and was making a lot of money for the owner. And you would have to say that it was logical business sense to be flushing that ewe so that it could actually generate more income for that business and that farm. But after scratching my head a bit and realizing that this wasn't really targeting sort of production traits that we needed. And bearing in mind, I'd spent quite a long time in New Zealand. And when I was in New Zealand, it was on the cusp of when Romneys were starting to be recorded. And I was involved with some of those very early pioneers in New Zealand. And I realized that we had to do something because the industry over here just wasn't. It was just too disconnected. It was effectively breeding for itself. And then all the sort of the important traits that we thought would be needed in the future weren't really being looked at. And as a consequence, we started our own genetics business to breed our own sheep, using models similar to the pig industry, but obviously having to modify those quite substantially because sheep are not pigs or poultry. They're far less efficient. But we took elements of those. And it's taken us a long time to actually build something from that. In fact, from about 2007, we started until current day. And it's probably nearly killed us in doing it and nearly destroyed the business because it's been very cash hungry, because unfortunately sheep don't always do what you want them to do. So they don't always turn out like peas in a pod. They don't always have correct structure. They don't always live. So as a consequence, our projections of growth, instead of being really racy like you'd love it to be for a venture capitalist, have always been a bit more plateaued, but going very much in the right direction. And I suppose that the sign of that direction was that by the sort of early 2011, 12, we were starting to get a kickback from our pedigree customers saying, Innovis is doing my insemination work, but actually also competing in my marketplace with rams. And I could understand that because I think I'd be equally naffed with it. So we were building our sheep genetics business only to erode our services business because we were effectively upsetting our commercial customer base that was using the services. So by 2015, I structured a deal where we brought a new investor into the business from New Zealand that had some pretty neat in vitro production technology in cattle. And we brought them into the business and separated the business and rebranded the business completely and called it AB Europe, the business in New Zealand being called Animal Breeding Services in New Zealand. So we took their logos and their brand and put it over this business, and also then developed a cattle component to AB Europe. So now we have quite an effective laboratory in Edinburgh that produces IVP. So we take eggs out of the cows instead of embryos. So we take eggs out of them, which is far less intrusive. They don't have to be stimulated. And we then put them into the laboratory. We can then mix them with different bulls if we so choose. Instead of having to just use one bull, we can use sex semen. And over an 8-day period, we can actually create embryos that will then be frozen and sent back to the farm, or can be put into recipients, cows, and then sold back to the customer as in-calf heifers with their progeny in them. And it's working so well, we're just in the process of setting up a new laboratory down in Ireland, in Cork. So AB Ireland is just about to launch this month. So the business is going well from strength to strength in terms of artificial breeding services. But the majority of the people using it on the sheep side are still the same people, still the same pedigree sector, breeding for phenotype and breeding for the traits that makes them very good money in their sphere. And a small proportion breeding for what I would classify as more important traits within all of that. But that's fine. They can carry on doing that. And I'm going to dwell tonight on the genetics business, which is what you see on the right of your screen, really, because that's really where I think the future of the UK sheep industry sort of sits. And it may not be with Innovis, it may be with others that are doing something similar. But there is a pathway that I think, and I'd like to share with you, that takes us towards something that's much more sustainable. So that's where we're going to head. But I'm just going to zoom out just for a second, just to put a little bit of perspective in our global sheep production, because it's all too easy to just drill in on certain factors instead of actually just looking out and seeing how we fit into all of this. Now, I saw you had a very informative and very good a talk from Michael Lee on the 29th. In fact, I watched it the other day and I thought it was really, really good in terms of putting perspective on global food production. And again, this is exactly where sheep fit into the world program. So we need to feed our growing population, but we need to do it in a sustainable way. And I think, as Michael said very aptly in that presentation, sustainability is very, very complicated in terms of how you work out the dynamics of it. But we have economic, social, and environmental sustainability, and all of those as a whole add to something that we need to focus on. Now, what's good for us is that genetic improvement is really clever, because even if you've got limited water, limited land that can be used for this sensibly, then genetic improvement accelerates productivity from that. So really clever that genetic improvement does this, and it does this very, very well in poultry, pigs, dairy, beef to some degree, and works equally well in sheep. But accessing this sometimes is a bit more difficult because there's more noise associated with ruminant production. So, but it's a key that we need to focus on. Now, as an animal, and really important for us to understand this, you know, a sheep is relatively small. So a lamb, when it's ready to be slaughtered, is probably about 45 kilos live, which is about 20 kilos dead weight. Now, that means that a processing cost of a lamb, which is normally between 12 and 15 pounds, is quite a big cost relative to the amount of meat that you're getting. And unfortunately, our woolies aren't the most reproductively capable. They breed once a year, unless you have specific breeds like a Dorset or you're using synchronization, and they're not as effective. Whereas compared to the sow, for example, that'll give you, 24, 25 piglets in a year, and will actually be very efficient in how that sow produces a meat of 2 tons plus of meat, then it's the poor relative. But crucially important for us is that sheep and goats are very, very effective utilizers of areas of the world that very little else can work. And even within elements of more productive ground, having that grassland component within that is actually becoming more prominent. So again, they do things that other species won't or can't when it comes to protein production and fiber production. So there's lots of sheep in the world, about 1.1 billion, and the market is actually quite valuable in terms of its total worth. And as you can see, meat production is by far the biggest chunk of that market. But here lies the problem. In many parts of the world, sheep are, as I said, the poor relative, the sort of the crop of last resort, because you're not going to keep other animals there. You're certainly going to crop there. And a big chunk of the world sheep population sits in Africa and Asia, and in often, farmed in very nomadic peasant systems. Very important within those, very, very important in terms of sustainability, and quite often a crucial part of their business. But we have a big range, from the intensive sort of fed animals to the intensive pastures, the grain animals, and the nomadic ones. And what doesn't help us is that we're quite fragmented as an industry. There's over 300 breeds globally. There's over 92 breeds in the UK. 11 of those 92, plus Innovis sheep, are the ones that are relevant in the UK. So lots of breeds, and lots of passion towards keeping some of the native breeds going, and that's great. And we always support that because it's part of our heritage and that social element of our being in the rural community. So, but the fact that there's so many makes it difficult quite often to actually make progress within these systems. So the changes that are facing our sheep producers, and I know some of you on the call will be sheep producers, Thomas being one, obviously from the family background. So the change in mindset that currently faces us in our industry And I suppose what you see behind that slide, which is that luscious green stuff, plays a big part in all of this, really. And our future needs to have a much more sustainable, regenerative approach to it. And that means we need to think differently about our farm. And I always start that by saying to somebody, if you're going to go around your stock tomorrow, leave the quad at home and walk. Walk and actually go through the fields, go past the rivers, actually see what's happening around you, because quite often we're very busy in what we do. We're very focused on certain things, but actually our focus needs to be much more about the fact that we've got a living organism at our feet. And that's crucial, because that soil health and that diversity and that ecosystem is what drives everything. And that's quite a big mindset change for most of our farmers, because we've been conditioned from that Second World War to produce. We've then been told to extensify in certain areas without really understanding the logic sometimes. And then now we're being told something different. But this one makes absolute sense. This is one of the elements out of organic farming that is fundamental in my mind, that makes sense for production. And with that comes our drop in dependency on monocultures, on specific sterile crops, on the use of huge numbers of chemicals. And there is a compromise and a debate, and most of you will be aware of arable systems, and obviously glyphosate and minimum till. You know, there is a benefit in using that, but yet there is a trade-off in terms of its impact. And those are the kinds of things of the next, I suppose, decade, as an industry, we have to wrestle with and come to what is a sensible, logical conclusion. And we certainly need to reduce our emphasis on purchase feed and grow more from what we can within our systems. Even to the extent for people that are buying in compounded feed, you know, changing to rapeseed instead of soya, actually using red clover in the forage components, lots of different ways to actually balance this out so that we can actually be a bit more sustainable. And we have to understand that our beloved society, as urban as it is, has lost connection with how food's produced. And that's been the case for quite a while now, where if you go to France, and I always used to remember going to the Paris show, and I used to see all the Parisians coming in, feeling the wonderful cattle, and they weren't feeling them to pat them, they were truly feeling the amount of meat, and they were visualizing the steaks on their rear end. But you think of that in our context, and people would be horrified in terms of that. And we need to have that sort of connection, but certainly we need to understand, and it's a changing feast, what public good is. And I don't even think our politicians quite understand that yet. So there's a bit of work towards that, but we've got to convey the common sense components of what we think is public good, because that's really the justification for getting the subsidization that we have. And for one, I'm actually quite pleased that the structural payments are changing, because I think they were flawed. They were flawed for youngsters like yourselves to come into the industry, and they were encouraging farmers to be lazy. If there's any farmers listening behind you here now, they're probably going to throw something at me, but you can ask the questions afterwards. Now, personally, and we've been working on this for a while, sheep farming, we've always thought needs to be on the sort of the marginal ground, and arable land needs to be in arable crops, fed directly to the human chain. However, we are getting approached continually from arable farms wanting sheep into their rotation, because they've got the dreaded blackgrass, they've got organic matter that's fallen down and soil structures fallen down, and they realize that that lovely Norfolk 4-crop rotation that used to be taught in the 70s and 80s actually has made sense to people again. And having a grass break in an arable rotation makes perfect sense, and having something woolly to graze that makes sense, or cattle in some instances. So we are seeing quite a lot of this transition and some of this operating currently. We also know that currently in the UK, we're utilizing just under half of what we grow as grass. That's a pretty poor stat, isn't it? And we know that we can take that 50% utilization up to about 60% if we rotationally graze, and we can push it into the high sort of heady 80% if we cell graze and do it really intensively. Now, in reality, there are parts of everybody's farm that lend themselves to some intensification and rotation, and there are parts of every farm that lend themselves to sensible conservation within the realms of the payments that are there. So we've been breeding sheep under challenge for quite a while, and I come on to talk about this in a minute, because sheep in a mob graze situation are challenged differently. They're not able to spread out and find their feed. They're having to compete, and that changes the dynamic of that. And you have to do some elements of watching the animal with all of this to make sure that you're not actually compromising that. And a new term that we're coming to grips with these days, lenient grazing. Now, again, our hill farmers have been doing this for decades in terms of putting sheep on the hill into very rough pastures, more linear quite often, and then coming off them. But we're talking about this approach in a more improved situation, a lowland situation, where we're building the biomass within our soils and actually dropping quite often those additional variable costs in a farm and letting the farm's base production level find its optimum production level. So in other words, what we would normally do naturally within that farm, and the output that is much lower probably than what's happening currently, but quite often the net return, something fairly similar. And again, we have lots to learn in that, but it's quite interesting in terms of how this is coming through. And obviously, you know, it's in all our interest to create wildlife and species-rich swards. And some of the matrices that we will be measured on, and probably rightly so, although there will probably be quite a lot of complexity and pain in getting to it, will be elements of water quality, will be soil carbon at a certain component, and certain biodiversities and things like doing, you know, bird counts at certain times of the year, which again, part and parcel of that living organism. Now, in whichever system we're working in, we have to add value wherever we can. And, you know, we're in a digital world. We're having a Zoom call tonight instead of going into a lecture room or a village hall somewhere. And we are able to access things now that we weren't before. Some of it is good, some of it is bad. But it's a great opportunity to use this appetite that the consumer has currently of being open to things online to really promote individuals as farmers, or for the farmer to take that into their own hand, be that boxed lamb, be that value-added products that they can produce for the farm, be it even just the PR element of what they're about, so that their society actually respects them and sees they're actually doing quite a good job within all of that. And communication with all of that is crucial, because farmers generally are quite poor at communication. Not all, but generally we're not very good at actually going out there and, you know, promoting ourselves. And that's something we need to learn to do, or we need to get people to do it with us, really. And ultimately, nobody will sell your business better than you. It's your business, it's your passion, it's your baby, and you can pay people, but ultimately, if you actually convey that from the heart of what it's about, it will be much more genuine and will have a much bigger impact. So doing that has to come from you, even if it's via an agency. You've still got to give them the material to be able to do that really with them. Now, I've already mentioned that there are lots of opportunities currently out there. One of the problems we have in the UK is that everybody wants to do everything in the sheep world. So instead of having a farm that has the land resource that will justify a breeding unit, in other words, ewes that are tupped to produce lambs, and when those lambs get to a certain age at weaning, they're then weighed and sold to somebody else that has land suitable to finish those lambs, so that that breeding farm can focus its attention on getting grass back ahead for ewes back into condition to optimize their scanning and rearing percentage for their farm. Now, the finisher quite often has access to arable crops and can finish in a much cheaper way and actually get a more consistent product. So actually disentangling breeding and finishing is quite an interesting component we need to just think about as an industry. And we need to be slightly less insular in trying to do it all to understand what the real strengths of our business are and what our resources are in terms of getting through to that. But the good news with all of this is there's really lots of opportunities for you guys. There's, for the first time in a long, long time, maybe ever, there is a real opportunity. If you're passionate about livestock farming, sheep specifically, you can get into it. And what you need is a bit of nous in terms of stockmanship and a hunger. And there are lots of arable farms out there eager to have sheep flocks, either in partnership with somebody or to work with them with an option to buy in down the line. So much so that we are going to be advertising a job next in May, which will be based in the East Midlands, Leicestershire, Lincolnshire, and specifically the job of that person will be to obviously sell the Innovis genetics to people, but will be to facilitate arable farmers going into sheep. So in other words, setting up their grazing systems, setting up the infrastructure they need for water, but also dealing with it from a very professional way, which most arable farms are operated on. You know, we know that good arable operations use agronomists very effectively, understand components of their farming business, use their tech and their machinery in the most cost-effective way possible. And there's no different with this. We just translate that sort of understanding into what sheep enterprises need to do. So if anybody's interested, please email me because it'll be quite an interesting job. It may well be based in a large estate that is already looking to convert into sheep. And there may be a dual-pronged job there where you're working for Innovis, actually developing all of this. And at the same time, you might have the opportunity to set up a 2,000 ewe flock on a very large estate, just in your spare time, so that it can be used as a demonstration to other people. So it's something that's coming, hopefully. Now, those faces peeping at the bottom of that screen are some of the Harper grads that are currently within our business, and there's more than that, but I thought it would get too crowded down there. So some of you will know Matt Harding, possibly, because Matt's been in Harper. He's been coming back to do various seminars on behalf of Innovis through the years. Kai Davis, Sean Downs, and more recently, Izzy Hartley is joining us in a few weeks' time. So we have lots of Harper grads, as I mentioned before. And it's really good that we've actually got access to so many good students as part of all of that. Now, when we start honing in on the sheep, the actual animal in all of this, we actually have to create sheep that are fit for this environment. There's no point us having sheep farmed on the side of the hill and we breed the genetics for that in a lowland farm somewhere by the sea in a very intensive, hands-on way if we're going to have a sheep lambing outdoors with minimal intervention. So we have to tailor the genotype to the environment. And likewise, if we're going to have sheep behind electric fences for most of their life, they have to be able to cope with that pressure in terms of 3-day moves, in terms of that ability to perform under that. So things need to change from some of that. And we do that really by making sure that the farming systems we select our sheep on within our breeding program are geared specifically to this, so that we're pulling the right traits out from all of this as we go, so that they're better able to meet this. And there is and will be, we suspect, a general trend for increasing the amount of lambing done outdoors. And there's a few drivers for that. There are elements of antibiotic resistance that builds up in some areas where, reducing that stocking density and having part of the flock lambing out, especially if it's a later lambing flock or half of the flock later on, makes perfect sense. And again, in these arable systems, no arable farmer is actually going to put a shed up to lamb sheep. They're going to lamb outdoors in a low-cost system, and they need to be able to do so with all 4 feet on the ground, so no lameness, and they need to be able to do so without having to lamb half of them. 1 or 2 in 100 we can live with, but much more than that becomes an issue. So again, having these abilities to do that is actually quite important. Now, you could argue that you see lots of social media footage currently of people lambing in sheds and getting really, really happy and excited with it. And you'll see Adam Henson on his 4, very clean, but you'll see Adam actually doing all of this sort of stuff and promoting this wonderful time of year to people. And it is, because life and spring is a good time for people. But as educational establishments, and not just Harper, but some of the colleges out there, and we work with many, we have our genetics working in lots of colleges, and I really urge these institutions to teach the students on nutrition, body condition score, getting those views into the right component, getting the elements of genetics right, and you won't have to lamb sheep because they just do it. And if somebody has a shed, and you will, and obviously sheds means that you will mitigate weather, bad weather. You will also mitigate losses at night, because you can be up and be with them, or you can pay students to do that. Then we don't necessarily advocate that you shouldn't be lambing indoors, because if it's a set system, it makes sense. What we do advocate, though, is that you actually focus it on a short period, because short period means you won't get disease buildup, you won't become overly tired, and that is a real issue for farmers. You go more than 3 weeks and you actually start losing focus, and obviously the cost and the efficiency of using casual labor becomes much more structured within all of that. But for that, we have to look at different components, which I'll touch on in a second. And as I mentioned before, the crux really of some of this regenerative approach is that you reduce your inputs, you optimize your outputs. They may be less than what they were, but you end up with the same, if not more, margin. And like I say, there is a sweet spot for that in most farms, but it might just take a while to find that, really. And coming back to our AI business, crucially for our ram breeding sector, there has to be more selection pressure put on the sheep for these kinds of traits. Having a sheep born with a twinkle in its eye and the ear in the right place does not relate to commercial production. So we have to have that rebalance within all of that in terms of how we select for these sheep. Now, we learned, because we've also got activity in the pig sector, we operate pig studs for PIC, Hermitage currently. We also understand the element of what influences genetic potential. Now, in a pig situation or a poultry situation, we can see the genetic effect and the genetic impact come straight through. Probably 80% of the production will be influenced by that genetic component, because the feed, the nutrition is managed really tightly, the health is managed really tightly. So we see that coming through. Unfortunately, in sheep flocks, if we have improved genetics, we probably might see 10–20% gain on productivity, because all of the other factors and noise that's going on there are diluting it because of what's there. So what we try and do with our customers is we try and take them on a journey, not just the fact that they buy our rams or ewes, but the fact that they then look at how they can feed them effectively from the green stuff, so that we can actually lower that cost of production. And, you know, things as simple as, you know, lambs now this time of year, as we get into April lambing flocks, people still put creep feeders out to them. Now, those creep feeders, those lambs are going to be eating out to them from about 7 days of age, and they're going to eat a percentage of their body weight, but they're going to be eating a creep feed that's probably 12 ME, that's probably 18–20% protein, and they're going to be scoffing away quite happily with it. But because their intake is based on a percentage of their dry matter intake, they're not eating the grass that's around it. And if that farm is farmed properly, the grass they're not eating, because their guts cannot deal with it in terms of gut fill, will be 12–13 ME and will be 28–29% protein. So quite often we see things like substitution, and instead of eating the stuff that's 6 or 7 pence a kilo to grow and is actually very good for the environment, we'll be feeding them something that's 30 pence a kilo and is actually quite detrimental, because that ground should be used to make bread or biscuits for humans as opposed to animal feed for our creatures. So trying to understand those dynamics of nutrition and getting that right. So this time of year, for example, a perfect time to check the condition score of the ewes. And if you've got proactive vets, they'll also suggest you do a metabolic profile. And that metabolic profile will work out the energy balance and also the long-term protein metabolism in the ewe, and will tell you if you're tracking in the right place for a trouble-free lambing. Yeah, so it's kind of investing in those little things that make the difference. Doing forage analysis and opening grass covers this time of year, really important, so we can actually plate meat to the farm, work out how much grass we've got there, do a forage analysis to see what the constitution is, because the first graze in the spring is higher dry matter normally, because it's actually built more through the winter, and will give us the grazing days on those fields before we drop into lambing fields. Yeah, so those are the kind of things that sheep farming of the future needs to do. Not put sheep in a shed 6 weeks pre-lambing, winter shear them, feed them the diet, and spend way too much labor and cost in doing that. It's a slightly different change of scenery. And within the health and disease component, we unfortunately in the sheep sector pay little heed to biosecurity, because we will go to a mart, we will trade a few sheep here and there, really because we want to have a social interaction, because farming is quite lonely quite often, and it's actually quite a nice place to go. But unfortunately, it's not a very clever place from a health and disease point of view, because if you're going to introduce disease into your flock, you're going to bring it in by bringing diseased sheep into your system. They may have resistant worms in them, and then you've got resistant worms on the farm. So it doesn't matter how many times you drench them with one of the 5 or 6 products or 4 products, they won't work. Or they may bring with them the lovely iceberg diseases that then start eking up your cost, because you'll have more barren ewes, you might have higher lamb losses, you'll have more ewes wasting and not staying to a longer age, and all of those things start eating away at your bottom line. And quite often you have to put more input into the flocks to deal with those, and those are those additional variable costs you're putting into your sheep system that give you very little gain because of it. Now, because we're a small business, we can't be having armies of people going out to do this. So we try and do it through demonstration, through our own farming systems, through customer flocks. We have a team of techs and vets that actually do some of it, and we work with industries. So for example, I'm busy most nights. It just about stops now this week as farmers go into lambing, but I've been over the last few weeks doing vet evenings. So we work with local vet practices up and down the country, and we offer to host for them an evening like this where I talk about various elements of breeding. And it works really well because farmers can come in, have their tea, they're not stressed, they can take what they want, they can ignore what they want, and actually we take them on a journey based on that. So we try and reach out to people to talk about common sense things, really, because that's what a lot of this is. with all of this. Now, quite a lot of the elements that have had to change is how we communicate with farmers. The majority of farmers, other than the early adopters, don't really want to talk too much about breeding values of a specific trait because it doesn't quite relate to their current world and sphere. But if I say to that farmer, you know, we have a breeding value here for prolificacy of 6, they'll think, okay, I'm not sure what that means. Whereas if I ask them what their lambing and rearing percentage is, and I then say to them, can we increase that for you? Will that be beneficial? And if we do, these are the rams that will do that for you. Or if we want to get lambs away sooner, we want to increase carcass weights. We want to actually do increased longevity in the flock so that you don't have as many replacements coming in. Those are outcome-based elements that then we can help them find the rams that they want. So instead of honing in on the little minutiae and the figures, actually dealing with those outcomes, because people get those and they work with them. And the best people to sell all of this, whatever we do in any sphere, are the farmers, the operators themselves. And the power of social media used responsibly in this scenario actually works quite well, because, or when COVID allows, the ability to actually have an evening walk and then have a cup of coffee or a cider or something afterwards with a pasty, and the ability to actually chew the fat with people doing it and using it. So we really try and get people to invest in the outcomes of the rams as opposed to the individual rams. And I always say to somebody, and we do it ourselves sometimes when we're looking for stock rams within the breeding program, we'll say, oh, that's a good ram. That's a good ram. But actually, we're really looking at his phenotype and structure, obviously, as opposed to delving into his figures. Quite often than not, we've done the figure part before then. So we only look at the better performing animals to look for the phenotype and the structure within all of those. But last year, the first 1,000 rams we sold were all sold directly to farmers without them seeing them. So there is a transition to people that they're starting to believe in this, the same as they would do with a dairy bull. You know, if I'm operating a robot in my dairy parlor, I'm going to pay heed to things like teat placement within the matrix of that bull, because it's going to have a direct impact on how many are going to go through that robot. And the same with calving interval, and the same in beef cattle. And certainly when we go into integrated and vertical supply chains of pig and poultry, you know, it's a given that that will be the case. But farmers are moving towards this as long as we talk about the right things in a sensible way with them. And we do have a team of people, which is who you see there, from the north of Scotland all the way down to the southwest of England, that are there to actually do that. And there will be a 6th spot in there by June of somebody in the eastern counties dealing with arable operations. So our breeding program has grown over that time, and I'm not sure if she's on the call, but Janet Roden, who some of you know in Harper, is integral to all of this, because this is Janet's very important to the job. Janet is our main geneticist, and she has a team of people working with her, making sense of all of this and actually running our genetic evaluations, and also developing lots of new traits, managing R&D, and really driving this forward. And the beauty really we have within our team is that we have geneticists that are from farming backgrounds. And not that that's essential, because some of our best staff in the business come from non-farming backgrounds with no baggage. But in this instance, having a geneticist that actually has bred their own sheep historically and has been brought up in that situation, knows exactly the kind of language and the kind of elements that are needed within all of this. So currently we have lambing down, just started now. Some of these flocks down here have started right through into mid-April, the northern flocks. We've got about 10,500 breeding ewes just about to lamb down in the breeding program. all of which will be performance recorded, either manually at lambing time or using DNA parentage to parent to do the assignments on them. So it's become a reasonable data set. And then obviously the beauty of all of this is becomes accumulative. So we add this in all the time, and it gives Janet some pretty useful data sets now that she can really move in terms of genetic gain and selection within the breeding program. Some of the lines we have, they're an irrelevance in many ways. It's a bit of a toolkit approach where it can deal with most farming systems. So there is one that's sort of geared on a blue-faced Leicester, if any of you know the sheep industry. There is one that's 100% New Zealand bred, and there's one that's a sort of a Texel-based maternal. One carries a prolificacy gene, which adds 0.5 of a lamb to what it's crossed with. And there's also a hill product coming along based on a Cheviot that's coming through. And we have meat grams. We call them meat grams because processors or retailers don't like terminal sires as a term. So meat lines, and again, we have our composite lines, and we've gone with composites for a couple of reasons, really. One, we want to really fast track, so we don't really want to be hindered by the diversity within a breed. If there's another breed that comes in that adds traits to that enables us to go quicker, we will put it in there. And the second part is we really didn't want to get embroiled in any breed society politics, because it just drags you down into treacle, whereas we needed to be much more articulate in what we do with our sheep. We have one that's based on a Suffolk, because people wanted a black head so they could distinguish phenotypically the lambs. And there's one 100% New Zealand based, so that again, it brings certain traits with it that complements the rest of the sheep that we have in here. Some of the drivers that we try and help farmers with at farm level revolve around some of these. One of them, for example, is weight. Most retail lambs need to fit within a 21 kilo weight band, because retail packs quite often can only accommodate certain weights within them. So the UK's market for carcasses sits up to about 21 and a half, which means that a 65 kilogram mature weight ewe is more than capable of dealing with that, and it doesn't need to be an 80 kilo ewe. Now, the significance of this is that that ewe, that female, will live on the farm for 365 days and will eat 2.5% of his body weight during that time. And if I want to reduce my feed bill, be it bought in feed or wrap, because I'm going to make silage, and just to give you an idea, instead of 6 pence a kilo for grazed grass, we're straight up to about 18, 19 pence a kilo for silage, and even greater if we actually put all of the components into it, really. So if I'm going to drop that ewe size and actually use a terminal sire that's going to grow that lamb very quickly and get me to weight, that's going to equate to me for that to 140 kilos less per ewe per year. And if I use an arbitrary of grass and a bit of something else at 10 pence a kilo, dry matter, 14 quid a ewe, 1,000 ewes, I've just shaved 14,000 quid off my feed bill. Yeah, to produce exactly the same output and to be much more sustainable. So we try and hold the weight of our ewes within the system. And we do that by having these. Janet comes up with some really clever algorithms that actually deals with these traits of lambs reared, which is really important, obviously, the mothering ability to take the work off the farmer this time of year, vigor and health the same, and obviously growth and carcass. But we have the brakes on ewe weight so that they don't get too big, because naturally, if you select sheep that grow faster, they also tend to get slightly bigger. So we pay heed to the fact that we have our sheep that have quite a lot of fat cover in them still, and also are managed in terms of their body weight so that we can actually deal with that. And Janet, in her usual clever way, has calculated that's 243 megajoules of energy over the 150-day winter. She's actually dealing with in terms of that genetic trend holding every year. Now, the other matrix that's really important in all farms, it doesn't matter if it's a hill farm or a lowland farm or an arable rotation farm, is lamb survival. Because if we put nutrients into that ewe in terms of actually getting lambs into her, losing lambs into a dead pile is costly, both in terms of the nutrients that we've wasted, and it's not very good environmentally based on that, and also the fact you have to pay to get rid of the damn things. So it's like a double whammy. So again, working on the component of the number of lambs sold per ewe mated. And again, we tend to forget that matrix because people have a memory loss. So for example, we will put 100 ewes to the ram, and we will scan and we will have 5 ewes empty. They quite often will get noted and will go to be killed. We'll then have 95 ewes lambing, and during that lambing period, something will come along like a fox and eat a lamb, and she will be without a lamb if you've missed it. Or quite often at the end of lambing, you might have 5 or 6 ewes that just don't lamb. They're what we call wet dries. And they may have lost their lambs, they may have reabsorbed. Now again, because we've then moved our attention into things like shearing and tailing, and we work through our calendar, they get mixed back into the flock and forgotten about. So the real matrix is the number of lambs weaned or sold to the number of ewes that's been tupped. But quite often we tend to have a bit of mist across that. But effectively, the number of lambs that we've produced and the carcass weight of those lambs is the crucial output per ewe with all of this. And obviously these lower weights become an issue for some of our hill flocks that have historically been producing light lamb, because when lambs are that small, they have a limited market. And while there is an export market into mainland Europe, which obviously has been quite topical over the last 12 months, that's fine. But when things start getting sticky with that, there has to be a mitigation and a way of getting lambs heavier so that they can hit the mainstream market of 16 kilos and above, really, in terms of their versatility, and again, to mitigate the risk with that. Now, when we look at some of the survival traits and lambing traits within some of our genetic lines, this is the kind of stuff that Janet will come up with. So we will get our genetic line, which is, so this is lamb vigor in our Abertex population and Aberdales. So this is the genetic line, and you know, there's a bit of sort of dipping there, but generally the right direction. But unfortunately, a genetic gain line doesn't mean very much unless you see it on the ground. So within our Abertex purebred population, in those 10,000 ewes, which they're not all Abertexes, but a proportion will be, this is what's happening physically within the breeding program. So in other words, how many lambs are needing some level of assistance to suckle within that 48-hour period after birth. And as you can see, that's dropped quite dramatically from where it was to having to do that with about 4 lambs in 100 currently. Now, equally important is lambing years. And you can see we were lambing quite a lot of these sheep back in 2010. And that's because the Abertex line had been established on British texel genetics. We had selected from shearling breeding flocks in the north of England, people that were producing some pretty sensible commercial sheep for the right traits, really high growth rate, sheep in the top sort of 5% in the Signet analysis, but actually functionally, they weren't behaving very well. So we then started bringing New Zealand texel genetics and mixing them through them. But if we put just New Zealand and keep it New Zealand, we lose the constitution, the conformation, the components that actually gives that lamb its premium in the live market or even in the killing out component. So we have a sort of a mix of the two, but select for the traits that are important for us. And we're lovely to see that actually now within our Abertex population, we can actually deal with about 8 lambs out of 10 that need any sort of level of assistance whatsoever. So again, it shows that, and that was probably a highest intervention of any of our breeds coming down to here. When we start talking about our New Zealand breeds, like the Primera and the Highlander, we're touching somewhere between 1% and 2% of those lambs within all of that, because they've had longer selection for that across the pond. Equally important are days to slaughter, because the longer that lamb is on your farm, the more he's eating, the more cost he's got for you in your environmental component, and also the more treatments you have to put into him. And this is our terminal sire, Aber Maxes, one of them. And this shows you that within Aber Max population, that's Janet's genetic line again. And hey presto, we've actually managed to shave nearly 3 weeks of days to 42 kilos. So within our Aber Max pure population, if that's what you want to call it, we're getting lambs to 42 kilos now, 3 weeks quicker than we were in 2014 on average. So that's quite racy for a sheep anyway, in this model. And that has a big environmental tick to it. Now, obviously, if everybody lambs at the same time to deal with grass growth, i.e. April, and all these lambs finish really quickly, we end up with a situation where all the lambs are going to hit the marketplace August, September, which isn't very clever, is it? Especially when some of our retailers are now saying, we're not going to have as much New Zealand lamb coming in. Part of that reason is that New Zealand product is heading into Asia, because the New Zealanders back in the 80s, when subsidization dropped off, they did 2 things very effectively. One was they learned to break down the carcass into its primal components, quarter, loins, and legs. And they started marketing globally based on those primal components instead of carcasses, which meant that they were targeting markets that gave the most value for those. Now, with African swine fever decimating the Chinese pig industry, there's been a protein gap, and New Zealand lamb has been flowing into there. So we're about 35% of what would normally be coming in from New Zealand into the UK currently, predominantly because of that. And obviously we have Brexit and tariffs having some impacts through some of this as well, until they find their feet. Now, the only thing that could change that, because it's much more beneficial for a New Zealand lamb to go to Asia, or part of the lamb, because they will pay more for the forequarter, but also they've got more shelf life because they've got there sooner. But there is quite a lot of development going on currently in Russia in terms of scaling up their national sheep flock. And there could well be a situation where Russian processors are looking to supply lamb down into China, which will again dislodge that component from New Zealand. So again, those are the kind of world dynamics of some of this that has an impact. But if we are to spread out our lambing patterns, if we are to lamb sheep early, then we can do it still on grass. If we manage closing covers in the winter, if we put sheep on winter crops and not ranch the whole farm, we can even lamb sheep out of season completely if we have certain cash crops in arable rotations that can deal with them. So there are lots of ways of dealing with this, but doing the same old of lambing in January for the early lamb market and feeding 12 pound of cake isn't really the answer to that, in our view, or my view anyway. Now, quite important with all of this as well, with breeding, is that the figures don't make the sheep. In fact, the figures are a tool within all of that. So we pay quite a lot of attention to functional traits of mobility, of foot structure, of mouth structure, of things like dagginess in the sheep. And those bums you see there will be the scores we use to determine how daggy a sheep is at tailing time, when the lambs are coming in at 4 weeks for DNA sampling. We crutch the ewe, but we actually score her so that we can actually breed. It's a heritable trait, so we can breed sheep like this, not like this, within all of that. And likewise, fecal egg counts. So we do individual fecal egg counts on a part of our population. When the worm count in the whole group is about 500 eggs per gram, we will then literally stick a finger up the bottom of the lamb, get a fecal sample, and then we will count the fecal output in that lamb versus its growth rate, and Janet will give it a breeding value for FEC, and that will go into the index as well within all of that. The feet of the nucleus flock, we actually score each foot individually once a year, And that's effectively giving us a foot health score. And again, some of those traits are coming through heritable, some more than others. So again, building those components into the breeding program. We condition score our sheep in the breeding program very regularly, 4 times a year. And again, we're building up a breeding value for condition score. And again, what Janet's come up with here is very, very smart. So because heritability, so in other words, its ability to pass to its offspring for things like lamb scanned is quite low, it means that progress is very slow. And obviously, the more environmental noise that comes into play, like the lamb's born and the lamb's reared, that drops. More environmental things get in the way. But hey presto, what we find is that actually the condition score of a sheep is much more heritable. So in other words, that capability of holding condition and passing that to its progeny is much more heritable. And by default, if we have sheep that can achieve 3.5 condition score at tupping time, this is what happens to their scanning percentages. So by default, by breeding sheep and selecting sheep that are holding condition and are able to regain condition easily, it means we can actually get sheep into the right optimal point for mating, which means that we set a production for the flock. So again, sometimes when you select for some of the traits, it's some of these other ones that actually lend themselves for you to get to where you want to be. Another one of the traits that's in development with Janet and Kim is selective for productive life. So again, which sheep within our system will give us 5+ productive years of lambs? And the only way we can measure that is by recording reasons that sheep fall out of the system. And again, it's a heritable trait. Not as strong as condition score, but still heritable. We can make some level of improvement with it. And we can now report certain lines within the breeding program that actually will enable a farm to reduce the number of replacements they have coming in. And if you look at a sheep flock at any one time, the drop-off in terms of culling rates in a flock will always be between shearling ewes that have lambed for the first time, if they've not lambed as ewe lambs, and their second crop. The attrition happens there. So the least number of replacements, especially if you're not tupping them running empty through the winter and a cost environmentally to the farm and to you, the lower they can become, the lower that are coming through, and the more sheep you've got at their optimum productivity in 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. Yeah, sometimes 6-year-olds, sometimes 7-year-olds even. So an ability to breed that into the sheep is quite important and a huge component of environmental benefits. Now, we don't like reinventing the wheel because I'm not very patient with that sort of stuff. We try and move quickly with elements. And if there's ways of doing that, we will. So we have 2 breed lines out of New Zealand deliberately so that we can actually leverage what's happened in New Zealand and what is happening in New Zealand all the time to bring those traits into the UK. So we don't lose time with it. So we bring stock rams into the country every couple of years. And it's always quite humorous. I end up going into the animal reception centre in Heathrow with my trailer, and I'm there with the film stars waiting for their pooches to come off the plane. So it's always an interesting dynamic when that happens. But we've got some really useful traits. Meat eating quality, for example, done on some of the work that's been going on in New Zealand. So, and again, we have to make sure that the population we're pulling from New Zealand is performing at the top of the New Zealand tree. Our partners in New Zealand are Focus Genetics, which is Landcorp, which is government. So they are the biggest sort of genetic resource, biggest farmers in New Zealand, and they're very, very evidence and science-based. So we know that the stuff we're getting from them is selected on top performance. And that's an example here where the Focus Prime, the Primeras, this is where they sit in terms of their their genetic gain compared to industry terminal sires and the gain. And within the top ranking sires, if you were to pull the top ranking sires in New Zealand, you'll see a huge number of these in the first few pages of that because of the approach they take. One of the challenges we have with them is actually making sure their phenotype is consistent enough and making sure their structure is consistent enough for the market in the UK. So we're always fighting with getting structure of pasterns and mouths correct so that actually they're easier to sell in the UK, because the emphasis is very much on the performance component within that in New Zealand. We do have some differentiated products, and Thomas knows this only too well, our chairman tonight, because his family are involved very much in producing Abervale lamb for Waitrose. So again, this was brought about from a challenge we had with Waitrose saying they wanted lamb that was better eating. So we set about trying to do that through some trial work. We funded a PhD with the Welsh Meat Levy Board, and ended up under Janet's wing being able to develop measures for eating quality using CT scanning, so using computer tomography. And if any of you have had the misfortune of having a CT scan, you'll know that it's not a pleasant experience. But we do have a mobile unit and we put lambs through it. And that gives us the ability to look for muscle density. And that density is really telling us how much fat there is within the muscle. And the least dense they are, the more intramuscular fat we have. And we use that as a proxy measure for eating quality, balanced with performance on the farm, because there is a slight trade-off with eating quality and some of the other carcass traits. So we select Abervale rams for suppliers into Waitrose that are selected on performance and their eating components based on intramuscular fat. We also have some genomic traits being developed for it, but we're just in the process of rolling those through the system currently. To make sure that this is a top shelf product, they've been forage reared and specific cuts offered. So again, genetic component of eating quality tends to be quite small. Nutrition and how they've actually been slaughtered and processed plays a much bigger part. But if we control all the components, it means there is a nice, consistent experience on the shelf for the shopper. In terms of getting past the look of the animal sometimes, and I always get harangued by pedigree breeders when I show some of our New Zealand terminal sires. They say, oh, they look like a fat lamb. And I always smile because I always say, well, how will they breed? And this is another retailer we work with. So this is Keepak. So in this instance, they buy the rams off Innovis and they lease them to their customers. And in this instance, they also do a little progeny test every year, just to make sure that the rams are performing and doing what we've said they will. And I'm happy to say they do. So in this instance, in a controlled environment on a farm in Pembrokeshire or Carmarthenshire, rams put over some ewes in a very commercial situation, although data is being captured. So as I mentioned before, only 2% assisted at birth, only 8% losses to 8 weeks. So these things can stay alive. And it doesn't matter what happens in terms of carcass, grading, you will never replace live lambs. Those lambs that are breathing and on the ground are the crux to profitability, always. So live lambs first and foremost, and then the other components. But actually, when we look at things like growth of the green stuff, we're still able to achieve an average of over 300 grams a day to that period. We're actually also getting pretty good hit rates within the specification that's needed, and even an increase in the number that are hitting those really higher end grades within that, which is quite surprising in many ways from that, and a decent enough carcass weight. If we looked at the 2020 data, that's just slipped over 20 kilo carcass weight. So again, working well. The ewe breed in this trial is Aberfield cross ewes, so one of our maternal lines. So the two genetic components mixing quite nicely together in that instance, really. And Thomas, that's probably enough of my talking, and then people may have questions. So just to sum up there, the future for our farmers sheep farmers is to produce this wonderful product we can, and the fiber, although we need to do some work in getting wool recognized again back into people's production in the most sustainable way we can with this environment and the soil health that we have. So that's our challenge ahead, really.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Dewi. Jeanette is here watching. I have seen her name on the list, so I'm sure she'll appreciate your mentions there. So we've got a question which has come in. So the first one which has come in, saying, you mentioned at the beginning, Innovis are still struggling to get more into commercial side. How are you trying to market yourself to get interest and change the mindset of commercial farmers rather than focusing on pedigree farmers?
Sure. Well, currently, although I say it's a challenge, we're achieving it fairly well. So to give you an example, the amount of performance recorded stock that's being used in the UK overall is fairly low, but we are bringing in somewhere in the region of 250 new customers every year, which is quite a decent number, because those are 250 new businesses that are engaging and coming on board with us. Now, one of the challenges we have is that the rams we produce cover a decent number of ewes if people have the confidence to use them. So our average ewe to ram ratio, I think, is about 70 ewes to the ram. And our average lifespan on the ram, based on questionnaires we get back from customers, is about 4.6 years. So if you've got 300 ewes and you've got 3 Innovis rams, we may not see that farmer for another 4 years before they need another ram. So our buying cycles are fairly irregular unless people have a big number of rams needed in that. Now, maternal rams tend to turn quicker than that because their daughters will start coming through the system. But we always advise, if you're self-replacing, we always advise that the young ewes, ewe lambs, shearling ewes, maybe even second crop ewes, go to a terminal sire. So some of the easier lambing terminal sires. And then by the time they're 3, they've effectively proven themselves to you that they're worthy of coming into your A flock to go pure. And that's quite a neat way of extending the buying cycle for the maternal ram, because their daughters, there's a lag before they come through, and you're actually getting product away from those younger ewes sooner. In terms of how we communicate with farmers, we do it as direct as possible. So everything we do tends to be digital these days. In a year that's just been with COVID, we have actually reached people pretty well, probably better than the industry, because we have that direct link with them. And obviously, we'd be quite happy to operate like that going into the future. But when events do open up, and socially for a community, they are very important, obviously, the shows, we do attend some of them just to have a presence there. But we'd far rather speak to farmers based on their business, what they want to do, and actually work with them for that longer term than we would going to a little beauty pageant and trying to produce pretty sheep. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you sort of answered a question which I had there, was about the sort of numbers of sort of rams people are hosting. What would you say is the sort of average of people sort of having 2 to 3 Innovis rams? Or is
yeah,
it
absolutely. So in terms of what people buy off us every year, the number of rams bought every year is about 2.4 rams per customer. Mm-hmm. Our biggest customers would have 60, 70 rams on the farm. Yeah. And then sometimes when you have a transitional period, we had a fairly big estate in the north of England last year, had a fairly radical move out with the old and in with the new, so they bought 25 rams. We had another big estate in Scotland the year before, bought 40 rams because they were changing wholesale their system. But we generally say to people, find your way through with it, so for example, you know, a terminal sire is normally an easy option for somebody, a meat ram, because they can use it, they can see that it's going to perform, that it's going to last, that it covers lots of ewes. They will get the benefits of the lamb, but it doesn't necessarily undo the fabric of their flock. The maternal ram is the next step then, really, whereas the maternal ram really is the one that changes the game. But quite often we try and get people to sort of take small steps towards it. And the same when we talk to people about, are they going to lamb outdoors? We always say, well, do a proportion of your flock, later part of the flock. So don't go wholeheartedly into it, so that you can feel your way through it and refine it as it goes. And we do try and take customers on that sort of journey with us. We support customers quite a lot. So, for example, we stand by the rams for their first mating period, because they've only just had them. So theoretically, not that much should go wrong with them, although sometimes it does. So we will give somebody replacements, and we will get all sorts of different scenarios. We'll get a phone call saying that my 2 rams from Innovis have gone lame. What am I going to do about it? Now, quite often when we get our vet to speak to their vet, we'll find that there may be CODD on that farm, and those rams will have been exposed to, in which case it's a matter of trying to get cover for that farm while those rams recover. But we still try and do something with it. If a ram gets killed by another ram, we will normally, again, although it's no fault of the ram or us, we will quite often still replace it as a goodwill gesture to the customer. If somebody's hounding us every other day for something that is not really logical, we will probably draw a line at that point. But generally speaking, we spend quite a lot of time in making sure that customers are supported, because our average prices for rams is about 800 quid a ram. So although it looks a decent amount compared to what people might have been spending, when we matriculate that against a minimum of 300 ewes that it's topped in its lifetime, it actually becomes a more sensible cost. And I always say to people, the cost of the ram isn't actually the purchase price of the ram. The cost of the ram is the purchase price divided by the ewes mated every year and mated over its lifetime. And then obviously that's the cost of the genetics coming in. And then the genetic gain is something hopefully they will see as they go through that. So yeah, we ask for feedback, not necessarily to get pat on the back and good feedback. We ask for feedback so we can actually improve.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. A couple more questions which have come in. One is saying, do you think herbal lays can be integrated into a modernized sheep farming system, or do you think that they aren't financially viable in the long run in improving condition for flushing or breeding?
Okay. Again, it depends wholly on the farm and the system. So I always say to people, don't try and improve your sward until you've actually got the nutrient status of that ground in the right place. Yeah, and that starts with pH, obviously. So screen for pH, apply lime. If it's really low, apply a ground lime and apply a prilled if you need to, so you could get an immediate impact, and then the longer term impact keeps coming in. And then you continue that top up every 3-4 years, whatever it is. And the P&K status is exactly the same, and the soil structure the same. Now, all those things being equal, and they rarely are, because it's normally an 18-month lead-in time to get to that status, right? But all those things being equal, we then say, right, if you're going to put a herbal lay in, assume it's going to give you 3 years, but not really much more than that. And within those 3 years, you will actually see some dramatic benefits in terms of nutrient uptake, because again, one of the big challenges we have with reseeds is that they're shallow rooting, which means that it takes a while to pull some of the nutrients up, and they're also generally tend to be quite wet. So when we have really wet conditions, quite often we see deficiencies kicking in on reseed sometimes, because the sheep isn't eating enough and it isn't actually rooted low enough to actually get some of these trace elements and some of these elements up. Whereas the herbal lays, especially if you've got elements like chicory, will start penetrating down on plantain. So you've got an ability to draw those up, and you get those protective proteins that help against worms. So we always say, as long as the mix isn't ridiculously more expensive, and I probably mean some in the region of 12-15 quid per hectare equivalent, If it's not much more than that in terms of putting the herbal blend into the normal mix, then there normally is a cost, there is a return on it. But only if establishment is good and only if the nutrient status is all right. But you have to accept that you have to rotationally graze them, and after 3 years, they will work their way out. But if you put a decent reseed in terms of grass mixes and a decent amount of white clover in there, of varied varieties so that they complement each other, you've still got a peppy, reseed even after 3 years for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years within all of that. And we always in our mixes put additional elements in there. We put high sugar ryegrasses so that, there are some real benefits for those, but we always put things like red fescue in there so that it gives us more resilience and ground cover. So we make sure that it's a variable mix so that, it gives you that longevity, because I always find that reseeding, the hidden cost of reseeding is the fallow ground, because you will put a winter crop in, which serves its purpose, and you will reseed in the spring. But you've got periods of that, you've got at least 6 to 8 weeks where you're not going to graze it even after the reseed's gone in. And that's at a crucial time of the year, which is April, May, when you're capturing the sun's energy, its maximum. You're actually photosynthesizing the most grass you're going to, and you're going to set production for that next 4 months. But unfortunately, with a new reseed, you've got that lag. So I think there are some real costs within all of this that we quite often forget about. And overseeding, obviously, which is the other option people can have, an overseeding into existing lays. Again, that all comes down to the conditions of getting moisture right and just hitting it at the right time. But we find that there is a cost benefit in herbal lays for those 3 years, as long as the seed cost isn't ridiculous and establishment is good.
That's great, thank you. The next one is saying, do you think any of the current Innovis breeds are well suited to hill/mountain ranges, or will the new Innovis breed using the Cheviot be better suited to those areas?
Okay. Well, there's a few options coming for people on that, which is good news. The current Innovis breeds tend to be a little bit too productive, if I was being honest. So, for example, a Highlander, which is really easy and is quite tough, in its purebred form would be way too productive. A cross of that, quite often over, for example, a Cheviot or a Blackie or a Welsh ewe, is actually quite useful. And we have farmers like Ewan Grant in the Central Highlands, Lagan that way, that he's put Highlanders over Blackies, and he's keeping those Highlander Blackies up there. And they're scanning for him, about the 150. But that's still quite high for a hill system, because if you've got a limited number of in-buy fields, you're really not going to want to send twins up the hill if you can help it. So there's always this sort of matrix there. So there is definitely a gap in the hill sector. We developed the Cheviot, and the reason we went for a Cheviot was that there was an existing recorded flock of Cheviot available to buy from somebody in Scotland. So we bought those because they had 12 years of data behind them. But unfortunately, they hadn't had quite the same selection pressure as what we put on them. So we managed to take what was 300 ewes down to 160 over 2 years by pushing them much harder. But the 160 are now starting to breed back up. And we've also put another Cheviot flock in from a much harder hill farm. So we currently have 2 Cheviot flocks, 300 ewes on one and about 200 in the other, which will be expanded because the flock that has the 300 is a big farm, 3,200 acre hill farm that has about 1,600 ewes in it. So there's a bigger genetic pool there. So the Cheviot product we're producing will be more suited to lamb at a slightly lower level than the Highlander. So you're looking at something like probably 100 well, our Cheviots currently this year have scanned at 165%. But still for some areas too prolific. So there needs to be a balance. The other flock is scanning at 125, so it's a lower component. The other element that is quite interesting is that Innovis is involved in Wales in developing the Welsh Hill Ram scheme with the Levy Board in Wales, where we've established about 54 hill flocks that are performance recording in Wales. And all of those flocks have a range of subtypes, from the sort of the improved Welsh Mountains down in Brecon that way, and South Wales, all the way through to the Cheviot types, all the way through to what's called the Tregaron type, through to the North Wales type that live on the side of Snowdon. So the ewe size reduces as you go into those areas. All are performance recording. They're using DNA parentage, as we do in our nucleus, so that they can record the sheep in that environment, which is really important, so that the right traits can be selected. And they're all producing, or the majority are producing rams into the marketplace. So the hill sector is going to change in terms of what's happening in Wales. Now, obviously, not everybody's going to want a white-faced Welsh Mountain tup. Not everybody's going to want an Innovis Cheviot type tup. There is limited improvement currently. There are a few flocks as part of the maternal sheep group in Scotland. So there's 2 or 3 flocks doing something with blackies, and there is a group of swale breeders in the north of England, about 5 or 6 of them, doing performance recording. So it's not that it's not happening out there. So there is a bit of a swell within all of this, but it does need a critical mass of breeders to be doing it, so that there is enough selection within all of that. And obviously, performance recording in itself tells you or gives you a prediction of the performance of the sheep. The real crux is how much pressure you put on them. So you can performance record in a soft, fluffy environment, or you can performance record in a hard, upland environment. And obviously, it's the latter you want to breed proper hill sheep. We're doing it with our Cheviots, and some of the flocks in Wales, these 54 are on very hard farms, but some of them are on lower lying farms that give them a better time. So I think there are things coming through that are quite useful for people. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. The next question is asking, do you see the movement of lambs from west to east for finishing on arable farms being a larger business, or are arable farms diversifying into year-round flocks?
It would be nice to think that it could be a business that transitions and that actually finishes on these farms. But my suspicion is that there will be 1 or 2 processes that will facilitate that. So there are some processes already doing this and sourcing lambs off some upland units and pulling them into finishers on contract. But I suspect the majority of those opportunities in the arable areas will be breeding flocks, because I think they will have a dynamic, because most of these arable estates have some level of permanent pasture, which can be used either for lambing use, or it can be used for dry use. There are some arable customers of ours lambing on Herbalist already. So for example, they're putting, so many hundreds of acres in as Herbalist, and then ewes are running through winter on different crops. They're then moved into a Herbalist field. One particular one, who's an ex-grad of Harper, actually, he sets up, he's got 16 paddocks, 30-acre paddocks, 16 of them. He puts 150 ewes in each paddock, and he lambs them down in those paddocks. They stay in those paddocks all the way through into weaning, and those are Herbalist paddocks in part of a rotation. He's developed a quite neat system where he puts a few straw bales, because they're accessible and not silly money there, as a funnel, and he trains the ewes to go through this funnel before they lamb, the week before lambing, and then when it comes to lambing itself, he closes the funnel off with some prattly hurdles, and then if there's any sheep that need to be caught, so he doesn't pressurize them on fences, he literally just drifts them, and they naturally drift into this funnel, and he's got them in a little pen, and he can lamb them there. So, there are means of doing it even on the rotation with Herbalist, for example, or quite often people will shift the ewes home and stock them on some permanent parkland, which most of these estates have. But again, you need sheep that can lamb, because lots of people are walking their dogs. So you don't want sheep on 3 legs, and you don't want sheep with big heads in the morning. So those are the sort of components of that, isn't it, really?
Mm. Yeah.
So I think whilst there'll be some processors doing the matching, and there'll be some individual farmers doing elements of finishing, I suspect that there will be more breeding flocks established in some of these scenarios. But that doesn't always have to be owned by the state. We've got some customers in Lincolnshire, for example, that weren't in agriculture 6 years ago, and one of them in particular, you might see him on social media, he's lambing 1,200 ewes this year, all owned. Yeah, completely new into farming.
Mm.
And that's because he's got heaps of land available to him. He's got a handling system, he's got a tractor and a stock box, and good dogs. And he's away, really. So
Yeah, in 6 years, it's quite a change, isn't it?
yeah, but I think that's really exciting, isn't it? Because if some of your fellow students out there are really into this sort of stuff, then there are opportunities there.
Yeah.
So,
and then finally for this evening, questions asking, are there any health and welfare traits being selected to avoid any specific diseases?
okay. Well, I've already mentioned worms. So effectively, we try and have a genetic tool for worms, effectively, where we can look at the output of the animal and we can give it a value, a breeding value. We know the genetic components of it. So we can create females or rams to breed females that will effectively drop the worm burden on the farm in the adult sheep, which by default, reduces the infection rate into lambs. And that's worms. In terms of the others, we don't currently. So what we have is a screening process where we look for the main iceberg, the production limiting diseases. And it's not straightforward, even the screening, because some of them have limited diagnostics on them. So my divisional, for example, we bleed proportion of sheep in each flock because it's fairly straightforward. The same with CLA, which is caseous lymphonitis. We bleed a proportion of the flock. And again, if there was a breakdown, there is a vaccine for CLA. If there's a breakdown on MV, you effectively have to screen and cull until you've got 2 clear tests 6 months apart. With some of the others, with Yonis, for example, we can do PCR on fecal samples. And again, we'll see if there's an issue of Yonis in the flock. And there is a vaccine we can import called Gidair, and that actually can be put into lambs before they're 4 months old and give them a decent level of protection. So we have a Yonis capability. When it comes to Borders disease, which is one of the others, again, you can actually test for borders within the flock, and the best test there is to bleed lambs within that year to see if it's circulating within them. And if you have an issue there, then to make sure that you're protecting customer flocks, we individually blood sample every ram that we sell. So all the rams, as they go through their final health checks now in May, June, will all get individually bled and run for a persistent effective status, a PI status, to make sure that none are PIs. So when somebody gets a ram, they'll have a certificate saying PI negative for Borders disease. OPA, which is the last of the big iceberg diseases, that's the more difficult one. There is no proper diagnostic currently unless it's fallen stock, and you have to do postmortems on fallen stock to pick it up. And when you find it, and you inevitably will, because with all these diseases, if you look hard enough, you will come across it somewhere in the industry. There is thoracic scanning, which we can use, which takes a snapshot of the lung and where there would be mass being formed. But again, it only gives you reassurance for a 3-6 month period because it can develop fairly quickly. So again, if you find an OPA case, you cull its progeny out of the system and you instigate a screen scenario, but you actually screen and put them into a risk group, and then you see if they deteriorate, because if there is an abscess, there's only one way it'll go. If they start improving, it's quite possible that it's pleurisy or something else, that it's getting over it. And in that instance, you rescan it. And if you're not sure, you actually put it down and you post-mortem it. So OPA is the more difficult one in all of that. So we do have some ideas of how we can select for some of it. Janet's currently trying to work with our vets to look at some of the sort of the immunological responses and some of the genes that are affecting that. Looking at some work that's been going on in a German research group. But we haven't gone down that route yet because it's going to take quite a bit of doing to have enough disease there to challenge the animals and also to actually work through those sort of training data sets to get it. So it's something that we're considering, but currently it's more of a screening and diagnostic to protect customer flocks. So hope that answers it.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And yeah, like I said, that answers all of our questions. So I'd just like to thank you again, Dewi, for your time this evening. Like I say, it's been recorded, so I'll send you a copy of this recording so you can use it if you want to for anything. I'd just like to thank you again for your time this evening. So thank you very much.
No worries at all. And stay safe, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers now.